going to point out a couple of places as well where you're going to be able to find these slides again. So if you, for some reason, misplace them, I house them on a website. So I will make sure that you get that website as well. But I'm so glad that you all are joining this morning to talk a little bit about TPACK and SAMR and what those acronyms are and how they're relevant to what you do. So I'm very excited to talk about it and try to make it as relevant as possible. So the name of this presentation is called Venn diagram, ladders and pools, oh my. And we're going to explain, if you are not familiar yet with these frameworks, you'll understand why that is the name of this presentation. I am Molly Holloman, and I am the educator on loan for the Division of Digital Teaching and Learning for DPI. And I'm actually your neighbor. I am in Dare County. I was a librarian at Manual Elementary School for almost 8 years, and I transitioned to this position back in December. So I was just kind of getting my feet on the ground and understanding a little bit what my role was going to be in terms of traveling all over the eastern part of the state to do professional learning and support teachers in both the Northeast and the Southeast. And then COVID happened. So just like all of you have been learning to do your jobs remotely, I have been doing the same. Some days are good. Some days are definitely a challenge. But this is really, really exciting. Like, I am thrilled to be talking with all of you in Currituck because you're close to home for me. And I have told Sandy that I'm here for you guys. I'm happy to come, whether it's virtually or when we get back to normal. I'm excited to be able to cross that bridge and come over and see you all in person. So if you're looking to get a hold of me, I put my email address on there. I'm happy to converse through email. I'm very active on Twitter. So if you would like to join me on there, I put a link as well. Catherine, thank you. I'm just getting some feedback. Perfect. Thank you. So you're welcome to reach out with me those different ways. And I wanted to mention we have 2 other educators on loan in our division. We have Chris Bennick, who started in February. So he is just as lost as I was for the last couple months, but he is doing awesome. He is in Wilson County, and he was at ITF for Wilson County. And then Stacy Lovedahl is our friend in the West. She's been doing this for about 2 years. So her name might be something that you've heard before. And many of you I know probably know Tika, because I believe she's been out to Currituck, and Tika Covell did some, that's whose position I filled. And again, before all of this crazy COVID and everything going on, they had moved around a little bit of money in terms of being able to find a 3rd representative. And it's been a great fun actually working with both Chris and Stacy. So be sure to follow along with some of the stuff we're doing. We're trying to start doing more virtual PD through our website asynchronously. So this hopefully is not the only time you'll hear from me, but I wanted to mention them because I'm sure you'll hear from them too. So, and I wanted to note on the bottom of this slide, and on all the slides is a link to our website. So again, that's kind of a work in progress, but you're welcome to go see what's on there now, and then just know that we're going to be evolving that website over the next couple weeks and months to make it even more teacher and user friendly. All right, so if anybody did not get the slides, I did put that in the chat, and I think both Kathy and Sandy have a link to that, so we'll make sure that that continuously gets put in there. But I'd love if I want to do a little kind of like a temperature check. So if you would open up either a new tab, so don't close this window, but open up a new tab and type in menti.com, or if you have a phone, this is super easy. You don't have to log into anything, but if you have a phone, you can just type in menti.com and then put in these 3 numbers. It'll ask you for 3 numbers. And I would love to rate your level of confidence in these 3 things. So I'm going to switch over. So I want to know how confident, how do you feel you got this about 3 different things. The first one is covering content. Are you working on that, or do you feel really like this is my jam? I'm super comfortable when I'm covering my content. This is not technology content. This is what you're teaching in your classroom content, your curriculum. Do you feel strong working on it, or it's my jam in terms of best practices, how your students learn using a variety of teaching practices? And then where are you on terms of implementing technology? I'm going to give you guys about another minute because I've had 3 people respond so far. Again, on the top of the screen, you should see menti.com is all you have to type in. And then you've got those digits. And we still got some more people responding. This is great. So again, just to recap, is the first one is how you cover content, your curriculum. Best practices is simply what's your level of comfort in terms of teaching students in a variety of methods, how you teach them, and then implementing technology. This is good. We have some good feedback, mostly feeling comfortable and confident in it. That's awesome. If you've never used this tool before, a Mentimeter, I love it. It's especially virtually, it's really good to feel like you can check in and I've asked all kinds of people, how are we feeling today? I've asked that question. And I've got another question coming up for you too. So you can leave your Menti open if you want to leave that tab open after you've answered it. We're going to have another question and just towards the end. And if you have any questions throughout, I mentioned this, but if you've just joined us, Kathy is helping to run the chat for me so that you can add questions in there. And I've said, you know, feel free to interrupt me if there's some questions as we're on the topic. But of course, we can always address things at the end as well. All right, so we're mostly confident in covering our content, implementing tech, which is great, and almost on the same place with employing best practices. So this is really good, helpful to be thinking about because that is where we're going to start with TPAC. So I'm going to jump back over to my slides. All right, so next slide. Melissa, it looks like you're not muted. Would you mind muting yourself so I don't get that? I get a little bit of feedback. Thank you. All right, so if you are not familiar with TPAC, this is the lovely Venn diagram that we have. And TPAC stands for Technological Knowledge, Pedagogical, and Content Knowledge. And they are layers. If you can see there, the color changes a little bit based on what parts of the Venn diagram are layering. This is originally from a framework that came out in the 80s with content knowledge and pedagogical knowledge being the focus. So technology was not part of that conversation. Then I think it was like 2009 when Drs. Mishra and Kohler worked together and said, you know, we need to, this is great, but we need to add technology. We need to think about where does technology fit when we're covering our content and we're thinking about how to reach students. So this is a pretty, you know, if you've seen it before, this is something that's probably looking familiar. There's not a lot of variation on the TPAC model in terms of maybe the Venn diagram looks different colors, but pretty much the Venn diagram idea is how it works. And I love starting with this when talking about TPACK and SAMR because to me they flow. This is like looking at when you're creating your lesson plan. Okay, this is how I like to think about it. I'm going to come back to this slide because this is exactly how I think about it. Okay, I'm thinking about my students. What do I want them to know? That's the content. How are they going to learn it? That's pedagogical. And then finally ask yourself, when and where does technology fit in? So that's where it's hard to understand that when you're just looking at the picture, but really this is a layered concept. So I'm going to show this quick. This is, I think it's TPAC in 2 minutes. So I'm gonna have this video play for you. So I will give you a little heads up. Makes me laugh because the person that did this is totally Midwestern as I am, and I don't sound like it anymore, but this is what my family sounds like. She's got a pretty strong accent and it makes me laugh.
Here's TPAC in 2 minutes. For more information, visit tpac.org. So first we have to ask, what is it? Well, TPAC is a framework that combines 3 knowledge areas: our technological knowledge, content knowledge, and our pedagogical knowledge. And it looks at how they work together to increase student motivation and to make the content more accessible to students. We look at the content as the what. It's the subject matter we're teaching, like ecology, music, algebra, health, geometry, or art history, to name a few. Then we look at our pedagogical knowledge. It's the how. Every teacher has tools, so let's put them to use. Are we going to be using direct instruction? Will this be inquiry-based, group discussions? How are we going to make the content more accessible by the way we present it to our students? Then we look at selecting the appropriate technology because it's the partner. What tool will we select to make the content more accessible to the students while supporting the pedagogical strategy which we've identified will help to deliver this information to students? We must identify those support features to really help us use technology to reach our outcome. As we understand them individually, we can start to see overlaps. Our TP knowledge allows us to understand how we're making the content more accessible. Our TC knowledge allows us to identify the affordances of pairing the appropriate technology to the content. And our PC knowledge allows us to identify the affordances of pairing the appropriate pedagogical strategies with the content. TPAC comes from the overlapping in that center spot, or as we refer to it as the sweet spot, when all three knowledge areas work together. It's crucial to remember that surrounding this is the context. That's you and your students. This may look differently when you walk into classrooms because at the heart of TPAC is meeting students' needs.
Okay, so that is why I showed it, because that covers it so well. And I'm gonna click back and show a few of these parts. So when she talked about content, you know, this is I would go to that. So she talks about what you teach, right? So that's your art curriculum or your health curriculum. It could be science, right? If you're a 7th grade science teacher, it's what you are meaning to teach to your students. Pedagogical is all those tools that we have, right? So it's best practices. That's why I asked that question. But it's, you know, anything that you know that will help students learn. And then the technology is that, I love that she calls it the partner, because I think that's really the best way to look at it. Is it's never the first thing that we should be looking at. It's what and how first, and then when and where do we use that partner. So I thought that terminology she uses is really helpful in getting our head around, you know, where does technology fit in? And I think this is really relevant, even though TPAC and SAMR have been around for well over 10 years now. You know, these frameworks have been around, but we're going to use them now more than ever. Now that we've all been exposed to using technology to meet our students during this crisis, I think we've all probably learned some new tools, some tricks, and we're going to employ them in different ways next year, whether that is for remote purposes or just back in a normal classroom setting. So again, you know, we've not been as probably able to think through how these layers work together, because really it's just been responsive, right? Like, I'm responding to this crisis and I just need to figure out Google Classroom because my students need to get some kind of content. You're not thinking in terms of, you know, small group or collaboration and things like that yet. But again, looking ahead to the future, I think that these are really great frameworks to get your head wrapped around, you know, what do I want them to learn? How do I want them to learn? And what's the technology partner? So I think it's also important to, you know, when I think about TPAC, I think about the students, but I also think about myself. And you know, I, as a librarian, felt pretty comfortable coming from a content area. My first principal asked me to talk or to study and know the curriculum, K through 5. So I would, you know, this was about when Common Core was making its big appearance, that I was coming into the library. So I spent all kinds of time reading up about Common Core and making sure I understood K through 5, what ELA and math standards were. And then I would also study the standard course of study for social studies and science, K through 5. So I felt like I was knowing the content, but who knew it better than me was those teachers. So a lot of times I would collaborate with the teachers and say, tell me specifically what you're working on in 5th grade science. Oh, you're working on biomes? Okay, well, the kids are going to learn that there in your classroom. But, you know, I have this really great project-based learning idea, okay? And this is how I'm hoping to do it in the library, and maybe I can pull in some technology and the kids can get exposed to using that tool and be more comfortable while also kind of covering that content. So I would often go to a teacher, classroom teacher, to feel more like I was covering the content in a way that was relevant to the students and to the goals of learning. And then also, you know, I was a brand new teacher. I did not go into the library with classroom experience. So pedagogical was not my strength. That was where I needed to go learn by doing and learn by watching. So when you're thinking about these 3 circles, don't feel like you have to be the expert in all 3 of them. If you're an expert in content or you're an expert in technology, you know, don't shy away from reaching out to other experts in your building or in the district or beyond, because there's a lot of power in not only developing your skills and feeling like, oh, I can talk about the technology part of it because that is my strength, and I can go coach a couple other people as they're working through this, you know, but going and finding those people that can give you a couple more tools in your pedagogical circle, or, you know, understanding content a little bit better is always a good plan. So again, I showed this earlier, but kind of walking through, this is how I always think of TPAC, because acronyms are great, but there's a bajillion of them in education. So I always think about it in this kind of term and in this flow is, what do they need to know? How will they learn it? And when and where does technology fit in? Because right now it's having to fit in everywhere, but there are going to be times where it's not going to fit in. You know, art teachers, you need the hands-on, and not just art teachers, but just an example that pops in my head. You know, if you're given the option when we're back in school to use an iPad for drawing or supplies and hands-on drawing, you know, you're gonna not use technology. You're gonna focus on those other 2 content and pedagogical circles. Same thing with a band teacher, right? You know, if you're gonna give them an iPad to make music, that's great. But you're probably very anxious to get back into a band room and give them instruments to work with. So again, sometimes technology has a glaring fit, and sometimes you just consider, does it really fit here? So she mentioned this in that video, the 2-minute video I shared. But that circle, that dotted line, is not just there to look pretty. It's definitely, I think, the first thing to think about, right? The context. So the context around TPAC needs to start with you. And, you know, like I've just gave a few examples, your experiences coming in, and what are your goals and what are your beliefs? Your students, same thing. You know, if you are working with a great mixed class of students, you know, that in itself, environmentally and contextually, is going to be different than if you are working in a small group of ELL students. So, you know, these are things that we think about when we're talking about the TPAC framework. It's going to look different for everybody in their environment. And then I think also, you know, the glaring example right now is the context of COVID teaching is that we're heavily relying on technology. That's why we're here this morning, right? We're using technology to get professional learning. And, you know, that's a huge part of looking at the framework as well. You know, when you're back in your classrooms and things feel a little bit normal again, the way that you would use this framework is going to be different than how we are reactive teaching right now. The content knowledge, so just kind of walking through this a little bit slower and breaking it down. The content knowledge is thinking like, what do learners need to know? What am I teaching? And as I mentioned, this is really subject and curriculum focused. But it also could be things like the 4 C's. You know, if I want, you know, my students are really struggling right now with critical thinking. You know, they're just stopping at that very first answer and they're not willing to push past it. So we're going to do this science project, but a part of it's going to be they can't Google the answers, right? They're going to really have to dig in. I think of project-based learning in this kind of circumstance. You know, what can they be looking at with realistic solutions, and that there's going to be that productive struggle. I want them to think critically about this problem. So that would fall in the content side of things. I jumped a little ahead by saying project-based learning, but you know, thinking about what skills do you want students to develop beyond just teaching the curriculum. So is there anything else that comes to mind when I say content knowledge? If you have something else that I haven't included on this, I'd love for you to drop it in the chat. So is there something that's popping up in your head right now that's like, they feel like this would fit in the content knowledge bubble? Feel free to put that in the chat. So Melissa has this question. Do you find observing those within your content more helpful than outside your content? I like observing instruction outside my content to play off my ideas. Melissa, I think that is an excellent thing to do. Again, my lens as a librarian has always been very interdisciplinary, and how do those things come together? But I also like, for what you said, being able to play those ideas off each other, like how can I marry science and ELA? But I think, if you feel that there's something lacking in your content toolkit, like there's something I could be doing this better and I just need ideas, like that would be the reason to go watch somebody in your same content area. That's, to me, that would be a reason why. If there's something like something with reading instruction, for example, comes to mind. And I have this wonderful second grade teacher that I used to work with, and she was like the best at teaching kids reading in second grade. So I would go to her classroom and say, I'm struggling. I can get the joy of reading to be a big part of what I'm doing, but I'm struggling with how to find how to really build the confidence in students. And I would go and observe her. So I hope that helps. I hope that answers the question. All right, so moving on to the next one is pedagogical knowledge. Again, this is how will students learn. So I use the example of project-based learning. That might be a method that you would choose to use if your goal is to do something like critical thinking and some kind of, actionable, relatable topic where students can answer some question that is impacting the community. Multimodal, right? So it's how will students learn can be something as simple as I'm going to stand in front of the classroom, they're going to take notes, and then they're going to be assessed at the end. That might be, how the pedagogical side of things. Is that a best practice? Well, maybe it is for that specific lesson, but then maybe the next day they work in small groups. Maybe you pull in some kind of cultural relevance. So again, it's just thinking about how will students learn this. And if there's anything that comes up for this one, any questions about this, where does it fit, or any examples that I haven't included, I would love for you to put that in there. Trying to pause just so people feel like they can answer. All right, and then the third part, again, is technological knowledge. So after I've thought about what do I want students to learn, how will they learn it, that's where we factor in, is there some technology that will fit well with this lesson? Is there something that will help increase student engagement and or impact the learning, right? So is it better if my students can read the most up-to-date, if they're doing something with research, could they do the most, especially right now with let's use the coronavirus, because we really can't get away from it. Is it better for students to be reading something out of a textbook about the 1918 play, or is it better for them to be reading something, current event-wise that's showing up on Time for Kids, for example, or CNN for Kids? There's definitely times where we're going to feel like that's going to be a more impactful, the technology is going to be more impactful. But again, just taking the time to think about, right now we have to use devices, right? But is there an app that would be useful for this? Or is there something that might not be? Again, I think that the conversation, we're trending towards more technology. But it's okay to kind of weigh out the pros and cons of using that technology. And we're going to get to the why in just a second. That's where the SAMR part's going to come in. Is there anything else that I've left off this list that you want to add? So I have devices, apps, websites, and digital resources. And again, feel free to use the chat. You can pop things in there, or if you have any questions as I go, like Melissa did, I'm happy to answer them as we go. All right, so we covered TPAC. TPAC is this what, how, and when and where does technology fit in. Then if you've decided, yes, I'm going to use some technology, okay, we need to think about why. And a lot of times, I'm guilty of this. I learn about a new technology tool like, say, Flipgrid. And I'm like, that is so cool. I totally want to use Flipgrid. And I start with that. Well, that's not as effective as thinking in terms of, the students learning first. It's not the tool that I should be focused on. It's what do I want the kids to be doing? And then again, finally, how does that fit in? Where does that technology fit in? And this is where our second framework falls into what we're discussing today. So I'm totally going to say his name wrong, and I've tried to practice it, and I knew I wouldn't get it right. So respectfully, I'm going to call him Dr. Rubin. But he's the one that created the SAMR framework. And SAMR stands for Substitution, Augmentation, Modification, and Redefinition. And it's a mouthful. But hopefully when we break it down over the next, I have a few other examples, break it down and it will start to make a little bit more sense. So substitution is simply saying, instead of using paper and pencil, we are going to use the computer. It is an exact same lesson, but it's just being done on a computer. Augmentation is there's a step up. Okay, so you'll see this ladder. We're going to talk about the ladder, but that was the mindset when Dr. Rubin first came up with this, was some kind of a ladder. You know, it's moving your way up. Okay, so augmentation is I'm going to take that substitution of technology, and then there's some kind of functionality that improves what I was trying to do with students, and that's the augmentation. Modification is the task has changed now, so there's something, and I'm being really abstract. I have some concrete examples we're going to get to, but modification is it's now switched. Something has changed significantly, and then finally we're moving in that direction of redefinition, where this couldn't have been done without the technology. The technology has to be a part of it. Otherwise the task couldn't have even been completed. So here's I love this with the Bloom's taxonomy next to it, because this is where it clicked for me, that there are times, right, just like Bloom's, where students just have to remember or understand and apply. So that's not a bad thing to be on that side of that part of the ladder. But eventually we do want to move up the ladder. We want to move up the Bloom's taxonomy pyramid and get to where students are doing more complex work, like analyzing, evaluating, and creating. So that's how it fits with how SAMR and the Bloom's taxonomy fit with each other. And there's a longer article. I wanted to point this out. I've put a lot of links in these slides. That again, the goal of this was just to give an overview and an understanding if you'd heard about it a couple years ago, but it had left your brain, or you just needed a reset of it, or maybe you're anxious to dig a little bit deeper. But I wanted to focus just on an overview today. But I did have a lot of great resources. So I wanted to point out that all of these things are hot links. So if you wanted to read a little bit more about SAMR and Bloom's, there's an article attached to that if you'd like to dig deeper. I'm going to let John Spencer, just like I did on the Tpac, explain this in about 2 minutes. And this is a really a concrete example that gets used a lot, but it's really helpful for thinking about those 4 steps.
Technology has the power to transform student learning. But what happens when it doesn't? What happens when that class set of iPads is nothing more than a class set of really expensive digital worksheets? The SAMR model tackles these issues with a focus on the intersection of technology and pedagogy. This model has 4 different layers, the first 2 focusing on enhancing the learning task, while the next 2 layers focus on actual transformation. With substitution, the technology acts as a direct substitute with no significant change. So a student typing an essay on a computer is merely swapping out paper for a laptop. With augmentation, the technology acts as a substitution with some functional improvement. So that same essay is now done on a Google document with the ability to have classmates leave comments on one another's work. With modification, technology allows for significant task redesign. So that same essay is now a blog post. Students are doing research online, editing on a shared document, and publishing to an authentic audience. It is no longer an essay. It is an article crafted for the world. With redefinition, the technology allows for new tasks that were previously inconceivable. So that same essay is now a multimedia package. Students are not only researching online, but connecting with experts through video conferencing. They are co-writing their posts with a digital blogging cohort from around the world. And they are producing not only a blog post, but also a corresponding podcast and an edited video. Notice that the higher up you move through the SAMR model, the more transformative the technology task becomes, both in terms of multimedia content creation and in terms of communication with the rest of the world.
Okay, so like I said, this is this idea of pen and paper to using a word processor to using spell check and being able to comment like this exam, and then moving all the way up to like multimedia publishing with experts, making it world known, blah, blah, blah. Like that is the most, to me, for all the SAMR talk that I've had and heard, that is like the go-to example, okay? And I'm going to come back and talk about that. But this was a recent, this is the source that I got this idea from. Martin County Schools did a presentation back in January of 2020. So this is a very recent article and presentation that they did. So this is, again, just a couple months ago. And I wanted to point it out because I think the discussion about SAMR and TPAC has seemed to fall off a little bit. But like I said at the beginning of this, I don't think that's more relevant than it ever has been in the current situation that we're in, and then again moving forward. But I thought this was a really, really strong example, was moving from, you'll notice I kind of took that ladder and I've now turned it sideways. And that's because I think that there's a little bit of flow, okay? So walking through this example, as substitution phases, we had VHS tapes. And then with the technology advancement of DVDs, we moved from watching TV or watching a movie on a VCR to a DVD player. Okay, same movie, nothing has really changed other than the device that we watch it on, right? Like a tape versus a disc. Augmentation was when Netflix said, we'll mail it to you. You can subscribe and put it in a menu, and we'll send it to you when it's available. So now it's the same thing. It's a disc. But there's now this like an added enhancement that it will come to me through the mail. Modification went, all right, we're not going to just send it to you in the mail, but you can also sign up for the service where you can subscribe and it will come to you on your screen at home. No device, no disc needed. So that modified it pretty significantly. And then that move completely redefined how we watch movies and TV. Netflix really was a game changer when we no longer had to go to Blockbuster to pick things up. It would be sent to us. And now we kind of know the history of what happened there. And now we're, to me, this example wouldn't have even been relevant, a year, 2 years ago? I know things like Hulu have been streaming for a while, but now most of us are getting our movies, our entertainment, even TV and sports through streaming. And, you look back at how many of us, right, so going back down that chart, many of us still have VHS tapes at home. So it doesn't mean that we can't still watch those VHS tapes. And sometimes that's the only way that you can watch The Wedding from 1985, right? Or childhood videos and recordings. So it doesn't mean that we don't still go back down the scale. It just means that now we have a very wide spectrum of how we can watch movies and get that entertainment. So I think this kind of explains a little bit better that the ladder is not the idea of moving up and staying up. Because in that example that John Spencer gave, I would be exhausted if I were trying to publish multimedia blog posts with experts and an authentic audience with my 720 students that I had in the library. That's a level that, it's great when you can reach it in your classroom or with your students, but the idea is never that you stay there. That's a total case of burnout. But it is really great, again, looking at this example of the spectrum, because we can see that there's value at every stage. So I really appreciated that Martin County Schools gave that example. It kind of flipped things for me to be a little bit more modern and applicable. So we've talked about Venn diagrams, then I've just explained the ladder, and we're on to pools. Okay, so this is the SAMR model, again, flipped sideways. And this image comes from Jackie Stevens. She works for the Friday Institute here in North Carolina. And it was inspired by, this is kind of funny, and I know Kathy knows who I'm talking about, but Carl Hooker took the idea of the ladder and he turned it into a pool. So we give credit to Carl Hooker for coming up with the pool. And I'm going to let Jackie explain a little bit about how her pool is a little different than his. But I've learned that Carl Hooker got his idea for the pool from Greg Gardner, who also worked at the Friday Institute, but it was when he was an ITF. So some of you might know some of the folks from the Friday Institute, but I just thought that was kind of some funny layering that I didn't know about when I have seen this image for many years and didn't know really where it came from. So, but Jackie Stevens has this image that you're looking at right here. And I wanted to point out that this is hot linked as well. So I'm going to click on it and open up a new window to show you. So she created this thing link. And if you're not familiar with thing link, what it does is you can hover over these little dots and it will give you some captions. It will give you, now she created this 5 years ago. So unfortunately, a couple of the items are no longer fresh, but so like this video isn't available anymore. But I do love the context that she gives for the 4 stages. So using the pool, again, I'm going to play the video here in just a second to have her talk about it. But what I wanted to show is that I love that she's got, it's okay to be on the side and look for support. So if you need arm floaties, find them. Your arm floaties might be people like Kathy Blades, who wants to be able to help. It might be your librarian. It might be a friend down the hall who does feel a little bit more comfortable or confident moving into the direction of, say, something like modification instead of simple substitution. And her whole argument with this is that it shouldn't just be a pool, right? That moving into the redefinition or the transformation side of things will exhaust you. If you are trying to create those multimedia blog posts that are expert level work, you'll be exhausted if you end up just treading water in the deep end. So this was a really great resource. Again, if you are looking for some examples, she gives something a little different than that digital word processing. So I wanted to make sure you saw that, but I'm going to show you this video where she discusses, I'm going to flip over back so that you can see this. I'm going to show you this video where she's talking about the swimming pool and how the model works. In terms of why a swimming pool and what can I do in the swimming pool. Whoops, sorry, hang on. There we go.
Imagine the SAMR model is a swimming pool. We have the enhancement shallow end and the transformative deep end. Across these technology waters are the 4 levels of the SAMR model. Substitution, where technology acts as a direct substitute with no functional change to the learning experience. Augmentation, when the technology acts as a direct tool substitute but with some functional improvements to the learning experience. Modification, where technology allows for significant task redesign within the learning experience. And redefinition, when technology allows for the creation of new tasks within the learning experience previously unimaginable. In the original SAMR model, there is a line separating substitution and augmentation from this modification redefinition goal, a line dividing educational enhancement from educational transformation. The message given is that educators must teach above the line with a focus on modification and redefinition. However, the realities of teaching and learning with digital tools and resources are not sustainable if you continue to tread water in the deep end. We would exhaust ourselves and sink. Therefore, it is suggested that you remove the line. Just as educators work across the levels of Bloom's taxonomy, the levels of the SAMR model must also be flexible and aligned to what students are doing in the classroom. Only teaching at the level of evaluate and create is impossible and ineffective, just as only integrating technology at the modification redefinition levels are unrealistic. Our goal now is to swim laps, but that is not all this metaphor helps us to see. Imagine too the myriad of educators swimming in these technology waters. Some may be doing cannonballs in the deep end, while some would rather stay in the shallow end. And others may need help even putting their toe in the technology waters. For these educators, special flotation supports, represented by professional development, coaching, and professional and personal learning networks, to name a few, are needed to help them begin to swim. But no matter where you swim in the pool, everyone can use supports and guidance working across the SAMR model to support student-centered learning, just as educators teach across Bloom's taxonomy to support students' skills and abilities. So erase the line and swim laps across the SAMR model.
So I hope that was helpful, because it was for me, especially when I first heard of the SAMR model and thinking about that ladder, and my brain went, there's no way you can just hang out on the top of that ladder and teach every day with technology in that way. You know, knowing students and knowing that sometimes they really do need to put, it needs to be down on that end of simply understanding the tool first, right? Like that's going to be the substitution level. And then moving through. So I love the idea of it being more of a spectrum, or this idea of swimming laps in the pool, not just hanging out at one end. So I want to go back to Menti and get another piece of feedback from you. So I'm going to flip over to my Menti, and I know that you're probably looking for the numbers, but they're on the top of the screen. Okay, so if you're looking at my screen now, you've got menti.com, and the numbers are the same as they were before. So 96, 29, and 41. So I want to know, if you're going to jump in this pool, okay, where are you going to feel the most comfortable? Are you going to feel, again, the idea is not that you're hanging out there all the time, but are you like, I'm poolside, give me my flotation device, or let me read my book? Or you think you're just kind of coming into the shallow end? Do you feel like you could probably make your way down that spectrum all the way to redefinition? Or are you like, I'm ready, let's swim laps? And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I'm not asking this to like catch anybody and make you feel like, I just want to hang out where my toes can touch. If that's where you are most of the time, I think that's great. If that's where your comfort zone is, if you're willing to branch out a little bit more eventually and move with some support to something like redefinition, maybe you need some hard examples of what that looks like. We're going to do that next week. But I'm just curious to see where we're at. Are you feeling you want to hang out outside the pool, shallow end, where your toes will touch, toes not touching anymore? Ready for the high dive? Or are you ready to swim laps like Michael Phelps? So far we have 9 responses, and most of us so far feel like the toes can still touch, which is good. And again, I've said this a couple times, the idea here was just to get an overview of these 2 frameworks and become a little bit more comfortable with the terminology. Next week, we're going to do a couple more sessions on specific examples and target areas for elementary, and one for secondary. And I'll talk about that again at the end. But I wanted to make sure this vocabulary and the frameworks made sense first. And then next week, we'll talk about examples. And then maybe your feelings will change a little bit about where you are in the pool. So with 11, I think we've got about half of you have responded. So that's great. And it's okay if you have not, if you don't feel like responding, you certainly don't have to. This is just, I think it's always interesting to see where people are. And to take that few seconds to reflect, now that you kind of have a better understanding of it, where do I feel most comfortable? And I've talked a little bit about myself throughout this, but, I would say for the most part, I was also in that augmentation, modification was like my comfort zone. That's where you would find me most in the pool. There were definitely times I was trying to move to redefinition and then swim laps a little bit. But as Jackie says in her video, it can be really exhausting for an educator to try to hang out in one place. And the realities of using technology is that there's a little bit of everything, right? Again, back to the idea that it's a spectrum. It's not a one-directional ladder. So I'm going to go back to our presentation. We're almost here to the end. If you have questions that have been kind of circulating in your head, please feel free to use the chat. Write them down. Again, we're going to talk again next week and the following week. So if things pop up, feel free to jot those ideas down. I wanted to show you a few other examples. Again, the SAMR model, when it first came out, this ladder idea was not, it was very well received, but then people started to say, but I think about it this way. I think about, again, I see it as a spectrum. Jackie and Carl Hooker and a couple other people have used this swimming pool analogy. I really like this one by Jen Roberts. She changed it to tech for teachers and students. So the same idea. Hers is set up as those kind of blocks, right? In the traditional level, the teacher designs the task using traditional pedagogy with technology supports, okay? That's reality, right? We do that a lot. Enhanced is that teacher integrating multiple tech tools to create enhanced learning experiences for students. So thinking where you're at right now, if you're using Google Classroom to deliver your content, but you're also using some other piece of technology, for example, Edpuzzle in Google Classroom, then you're enhanced. You're app smashing. You're using multiple technologies. That's enhanced, okay? Choice is the broad goals for student learning, and lets the students do things like a choice board, for example. That would be a great example of what that level looks like, that students could use different tools and different strategies to achieve a common goal. And then that high level redefinition, the very high level here of handing off. So instead, this is very student-centered, based on what students are interested in, what tools they feel most comfortable using, and they're creating the product. So I like that she flipped this. The SAMR model typically feels a little bit more teacher-oriented. What is the teacher doing to provide this experience for students? And instead, this flips this a little bit more to be student-centered, which I thought was a helpful example. And this is a learning rubric. This link will bring you to the whole rubric. I just took a screenshot of a couple examples here, but we'll probably talk about this a little bit more next week too, with the elementary and secondary examples. So he turned this into a rubric, and I really loved the words that he used to substitute in. So in this one, the technology replaced, it improved, it differentiated, and it transformed. So I thought this was another good, helpful understanding. Sometimes the vocabulary used by a doctor, a PhD theory level of tech integration might not be quite the same as a classroom teacher. So I really like that he used this, because it helped flip the understanding for me. And I like this criteria box. Let's do the same thing over again, but let's use technology, right? So instead of handwriting something, let's use technology and learn how to those typing skills. And then we just move up the spectrum there to all the way to learning is messy. So I thought this was a really great example as well. So to kind of wrap all of this up, so I want to give us a few minutes if you have any questions. Now you know why we called this Venns, Ladders, and Pools. Oh my! So again, there's so many acronyms out there. My hope is not necessarily that you feel like you have to remember what all of these words specifically are, but just be thinking in terms of how it's relevant and can be used to help you as your lesson planning and thinking more about tech integration, especially moving forward. I know at this point of the school year, we're looking to wrap things up and get to the end of this part of remote learning. But just through the experiences that you've had, you've probably found some good motivation to use more technology. You've seen how it can transform learning, and have been thinking about ways that you might be using this again in the future. So my hope is that, using these two frameworks, thinking about TPACK first, right? The idea of what do I want students to learn? How will they learn it? And when and where does technology fit? And if you decide that technology fits, then you start looking at that SAMR model and think, okay, so where on that spectrum is the technology? Am I trying to transform the learning experience, or am I just trying to do something more in the augmentation level, right? Or a differentiation using technology. I thought this wrapped it up. This was a really great blog post by Mark Anderson called ITs About Teaching and Learning. And I think this is something I'll probably come back to often, because I think it's just a really great reminder that he says that teachers need lots of professional development in order to develop technological knowledge. It is not for the idea that you use more technology. It's simply that, like we've talked about with content knowledge, like we've talked about with pedagogical techniques, it just helps build your toolkit. It helps you feel a little bit more comfortable and confident in knowing where is this a good place for technology, and now that I think that it is a good place for technology, what is the best tool and how will I use it? So I thought that was a really great way to tie things up here. So I want to say thank you so much for being here this morning and learning a little bit more about these two frameworks. On the EOL website, so on the Educator on Loan website, I have specifically put a website for TPACK and SAMR. So if you clicked on that link, you would come to this web page here where I told you I would have the slides. So these will not go anywhere. This will live right here on this website. If you're interested in digging a little bit deeper, specifically on these frameworks, I kind of created this is an interactive PDF. So there's some videos, some articles to read, and even a couple podcasts if you're more like, I want to walk and listen and not sit in front of the screen and read. So there's some TPACK, SAMR, and then a little bit of both on this bottom row. And then I also wanted to point out that on this page will live a Padlet. So over the next couple of weeks, we'll talk a little bit more about these. If questions come up, you have any resources that you find that are helpful or any examples of how you use these frameworks, feel free to add it right on this Padlet. So again, all of this will live on the website. I put a couple other videos that are a little bit longer than I wanted to show in our presentation, but if you want to watch and learn a little bit more, these are one on TPACK and one on SAMR. And again, if questions pop up, you can email me, but there's also that Padlet to add it to. And then finally, I think next week, I'll be back on Monday, and I'm going to talk specifically about elementary examples and how this can be used. That'll be at 9 a.m. And then at 11, I'm sorry, I think I put 11, but I meant 1. We're at 1, right, Sandy and Kathy? I think it's at 1 o'clock on Monday, and that will be secondary, so I got to change that. I apologize.
You have one question, Molly.
Okay, let's hear it.
It's over there. Melissa had a question. She put something in the chat. Are you looking at the document I shared with you?
I have it. Yep, I have it up right here.
That is Melissa's.
Okay, so just reading over it.
Yep.
So it says, I did answer the one about the going outside the content, and I agree with what she said, bringing those core subjects in, just going to where those, the example that comes to mind is, like I said, about that second grade teacher. I'd go to her class in kindergarten. I would go to kindergarten classrooms all the time just to hear how are they teaching these things. So I love that that's where she was wanting. So she said, I gave my students a website, and they were to pick 3 random ingredients that they think would not go together that they have at their house at this time. The website helps generate recipes. Yes, absolutely. So I think that looking at this example that Melissa said, I should keep reading it out loud because I know not everybody's in there, but it said the website helps generate recipes with those ingredients. Then I asked them to pick out the recipe and follow the steps to make the recipe. Is this a good example of SAMR modeling? So Melissa, yes, definitely, you use technology in a way that, to me, this isn't substitution, right? That would be like getting a recipe card, a paper recipe card versus finding it on a website, right? It's the exact same recipe. I follow the exact same steps. This is definitely more towards that, probably augmentation or modification. I think modification. So it's something that you couldn't really do without the technology, unless you had an expert, right, that could come up with all of these recipes from the top of their head. The last level, so the redefinition level, the transformation level would be if the students created that website. So that's more student creation level, but that is a really good example of it. I like that question. All right. If you have anything else, like I said, that comes up, feel free to jot it down and bring it to us next Monday, or use the Padlet, or reach out to me in my email. I'll be more than happy to answer questions along the way. But my hope was just that this became a little bit more comfortable to talk about in the next couple weeks and give you some frameworks to be thinking of when it comes to using technology in your lesson planning.
Molly, this was awesome. We really appreciate you sharing with us. I know it's been a crazy time for everybody, but this is very, even though we've been trying to do our thing for 6 weeks, 7 weeks, it's all blurring together. This has been wonderful, and we're very appreciative that you're going to join us again next week for some follow-ups. So we'll definitely be contacting you until you tell us to contact you anymore. So
Oh, this is good. Thank you so much. It's really been fun to connect this morning, and I'm looking forward to next week.
That's great. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thanks, everybody.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone, for being here this morning.